Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. How does a reproductive justice approach to healthcare change the way we understand childbirth and pregnancy? How can we draw on our holistic, embodied selves to build community in a time of heightened anxiety and precarity? My guest today, Miriam Zoila Pérez, has a diverse body of work that shows why intersectionality is the answer to both of those questions. Pérez is an award-winning queer Cuban-American writer and activist whose work on the intersections of race, health, and gender is motivated by a desire to understand how the world shapes our bodies. Pérez is the founder of Radical Doula, a blog that covers the intersections of birth activism and social justice from a doula's perspective. They are also the author of the Radical Doula Guide, a political primer for full-spectrum pregnancy and childbirth support. Their writing has appeared in the New York Times, Color Lines, The Nation, The American Prospect, More Magazine, and Rewire News. They are also the co-host of the podcast Radio Manea, which Remezcla calls the woke Latinx music podcast you should be listening to. In our interview, Pérez and I chat about the racially gendered politics of reproductive health, the intimacy of podcasting in the context of community formation, and why building a world where everyone can create the family of their choosing is how Pérez imagines otherwise, even in the midst of the global COVID-19 pandemic that we're all now living in. As you'll notice from our discussion towards the end of this episode, I recorded this interview during the first full week of U.S. nationwide social distancing due to COVID-19. So what I had originally planned to discuss on this week's episode when I sketched it out months ago suddenly took on a new significance. And frankly, Pérez and I were a bit unsure about how to proceed since we were both still processing the daily changes. It's also why the sound gets a little bit wonky at times since, like everyone else now, we're also juggling new work setups that aren't always ideal for audio recording. So I thank you for your patience in this challenging time, and I hope that our conversation about the importance of holistic approaches to health and social justice can provide some comfort as we all navigate this strange new world. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So as a longtime health and reproductive justice activist and advocate, themes of racialized health disparities and kind of feminist and queer approaches to bodies have really run across all of your varied projects. So to start us off today, I would love to hear what got you originally interested in the fields of health and reproductive justice.
I mean, I've always been interested in health and bodies. Even as a young kid, I often will tell the story that I remember being at middle school sleepovers and poring over my friends, whatever books they had, health books or books about their bodies. I've always just been really curious about that. I don't know exactly what the origins of that is, but it's just something I've always known about myself, that I always had a lot of curiosity about health and medicine and wanted to be a doctor and went to college being I'm going to be pre-med and I'm going to be a biology major. And I got kind of knocked off that path by organic chemistry, which is a really common, really common experience. And also kind of a purposeful one, right? They consider it a weed out course,
sure,
which is such a mess in so many ways. If you think about the kind of people we want to be healthcare providers and what organic chemistry has to do with that. So that kind of knocked me off that path. But I was still really interested and curious about health and ended up learning about doula work through a course on the anthropology of reproduction that I took at a nearby college. And I saw a documentary called Born in the USA that's a little bit antiquated at this point, but really kind of outlined sort of what's wrong with the way that we do obstetrics in the United States. And that really radicalized me. I left that class. I remember being whoa, that just changed my life. It really just it just lit up a lot of fires in me around what was wrong with or what is wrong with the way in which we handle pregnancy and birth in the United States. And so that led me down a path of considering midwifery and a midwife saying, hey, you should be a doula first to see if this is really something you want to do. So then I trained as a doula while I was in college and started volunteering as a doula in a hospital. I spent a summer doing that as a volunteer doula. And then that kind of led me to other work. So I don't know. I think I've always had a lot of curiosity about health and bodies and interest in learning more about it and figuring out how to support people in those arenas.
Nice. I want to talk about your guide, the Radical Doula Guide, in a minute, but maybe just for our listeners who aren't super familiar with doula work, could you just give kind of a brief overview of what does it mean to be a doula?
Yeah. So a doula is a person who provides support to people during pregnancy and childbirth. They like to say it's informational, emotional, and physical support, I think is the three buckets people use. So you're not a medical provider, you're not a midwife or a doctor, you're really like a support person. You focus on supporting people emotionally, helping them navigate the pregnancy and birth and the decisions they're going to make, giving them resources, helping them advocate for themselves and what they want with their providers. And then literally just being the person there who is only really focused on emotional support for them, not worried about, the health and well-being of the baby. Like that's the focus of the providers, but really just focusing on supporting that person emotionally. And it can look a lot of different ways depending on the context of the person that you're supporting and where they're giving birth and what resources they need. So there's a wide range to what that role can look like. And then there are also people who provide doula support to people during miscarriage and abortion. And that was something that I did for a number of years.
So one of the things that I've noticed about your approach to doula work and really your approach to reproductive justice issues more broadly is thinking intersectionally and not just in a kind of surface way, right? But thinking about how systems of power, systems of identity, systems of oppression, systems of resistance even intertwine in really complex ways in people's lives that have very real bodily and health effects, right? And so I'm curious, number one, maybe what got you interested in taking that kind of approach? Why do you think that's an interesting way to approach issues of health or reproduction? And then maybe where do you hope that healthcare or reproductive care goes in the future from that perspective?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's interesting. I would say it's my lived reality, so it's just the fact of my life that I am a queer person. I'm a genderqueer person. I'm Latinx. My parents are immigrants from Cuba. So like my life and my identity has always been intersectional, so I haven't had sort of, I guess, the privilege of seeing it any other way. And so for me, what made that kind of all make sense politically was when I learned about the reproductive justice framework as a young person and finally was like, oh, here's a political ideology that makes like my life make sense and my experiences make sense. Because when I started doing doula work, there was this feeling of, it's kind of strange that you're a doula and you're a queer person, or it's kind of strange that you're a doula and you're Latinx, because so many doulas at the time were white or married or upper middle class or all these different things that weren't part of my identities. It's strange that you're a doula and you're pro-choice and you support access to abortion. Like those things were seen as strange contradictions. And that was part of what motivated me to start my blog, Radical Doula, like 13 or 14 years ago now. And so when I learned about the reproductive justice framework, which is created by Black women and other women of color to explain the lived reality of life, not as something that felt like innovative or cool, but oh no, this is what life is. This represents how we live our lives. And so that really made it make sense to me politically that there's an approach to doing activist work and organizing work that is founded on this idea that most people, many people, particularly people without as much power and privilege, have intersecting identities, and that we have to have a way to understand that and to organize around that. And so, yeah, it's like I have a lot of marginalization and a lot of privilege. So I think it's complicated, right? It's not like, there's a dynamic there, right? Where I think most people have some level of privilege and some level of marginalization, and there's different layers to that. But yeah, for me, it's my lived reality. And so it was about finding a political framework that made that make sense and make what felt intuitive to me around like the values that I held and the parts of my identity that existed. It validated that and helped me find a community of people who also experienced that and understood that.
So I know a lot of our listeners know you from your work as a doula, obviously, but also your book, The Radical Doula Guide, which has influenced, I would say, a whole generation of doulas as well as pregnant people. Can you maybe tell our listeners a little bit about that guide? What made you want to write it? And what is a particularly radical approach to doula practice that you wanted to emphasize?
Well, thank you for that. I feel flattered by that statement. So I wrote the Radical Doula Guide because I wanted to create a resource. Like after I'd been blogging at Radical Doula for many years, I wanted to create a more tangible resource that was really geared toward people who are becoming doulas, who are experiencing doula trainings that were pretty apolitical, quote unquote, which I think is a fallacy, that you could have an apolitical doula training, but the doula training that I experienced, and this has changed a good amount in the last few years, which I'm really happy to see, but the, doula trainings have been, and I think some of them continue to be sort of done in a like race blind, class blind, like context where almost as if like we're, by not acknowledging race, class, sexuality, gender, we're just pretending like everybody we're serving is like an upper middle class white woman who's married to a man and has, insurance and speaks English and all this stuff. And so I wanted to create a resource that would offer people a political perspective to doula work and really kind of like counter that idea that those assumptions about who we're working with and who we are and what that means. And so it's a political primer for doula work and really gives like a very basic overview of like, how does race intersect with, maternal health? How does class intersect? How does gender intersect? How does power intersect? What about incarceration? What about language? What about immigration status? And it's really a beginning. It's a beginning. It's not a comprehensive education in those things, but it's a kind of accessible, short book that gives people at least some sense of how to think about their work in the context of this. And so it's interesting. I've had on my blog for many years, like this profile series where if you identify as a radical doula, you can answer some questions and I'll put them up on the site as a profile, because I've always felt like I don't own the term radical doula. Like I don't get to decide what that means, So I wanted to see how other people interpret it. And, for some people, particularly people with privilege, like white folks, and being a doula itself is radical. The idea of like just supporting people in this context is radical. But for me, being a radical doula was about, and is still about, bringing a political perspective to your work, seeing your work as social justice, seeing your work as being focused on supporting those who are the most marginalized, who, are really facing, life and death kind of situations when it comes to making it through pregnancy safely, not just people who are trying to have a better experience, but are already kind of doing okay in our current system. So yeah, it's a political approach to being a doula that acknowledges the reality of most of the people in our world who are facing, lots of different types of marginalization and really benefit from additional support. So yeah, that's about it. And I've sold 4,000 copies over the years, which is kind of astonishing to me that there are that many people doing this work and interested in it. And I'm almost sold out of all the print copies, so I'm starting to sell digital copies instead, which is maybe a little better in this era anyway. So yeah, if you're interested, if you're a doula or know a doula or just curious to learn kind of like a reproductive justice primer focused on pregnancy and birth, check out the book.
Awesome. One of the things that I find really compelling about your various projects, your journalism, your doula work, your books, your blog, your podcast, which I want to talk about more in a minute, is the way that you insist that these things are fundamentally intertwined, right? So a lot of your work would maybe fall under the category of cultural production broadly, but you also point out that cultural production is inherently political and wrapped up with issues of medicine and issues of ethics and issues of politics and economics. So they're not separate across your varied works. And that's certainly something that the show has highlighted as well, which is one of the reasons why I was so excited to have you on this.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we maybe turn to your podcast now? Because I think it makes some interesting connections with how you approach issues of culture and issues of identity, but in a different way, right? Because it's about music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you're the co-host, co-founder of the podcast Radio Manea. And this is a show that I know a lot of our listeners have said they're big fans of. So I think that we have some crossover audiences here.
That's awesome.
What got you interested in podcasting as a medium?
It was interesting. It wasn't like, oh, I want to start a podcast. What should I start a podcast about? This was 4 years ago, actually, this month, when Veronica Baeti Flores and I decided to start Radio Manea. And it was more of like we love talking about music. What can we do with that? So it started more with like the interest that we had. And I had been listening to podcasts. I'd been like training for a 5K or something. And so I'd been spending a lot of time listening to podcasts when I was running. And it just kind of had me curious about the medium. And so, yeah, it was more just like, oh, we have this fun thing that we love to talk about, she and I are both Latinx. She's from Venezuela. My people are from Cuba. So we have some like Caribbean sort of cultural connection, but we have really different tastes in music. And so we would do a lot of texting back and forth about music. And it really actually started as a joke where I was like, hey, how can we get an invite to the Latin Grammys one night when I was watching the Latin Grammys? And I was like, we should start a podcast. So it kind of just like came out of, I think, just energy really more than anything else. It wasn't like, oh, let's start a podcast. What do we start a podcast about?
Have you gotten that invitation yet?
No, we haven't, but we also have not actually solicited it.
Okay.
I think if we actually tried to get an invite, we could at this point. So it's more cool. It's more of a joke than anything else. I think we have like enough contact that we could probably, not that they're like looking for us to cover the Grammys, but like we could probably get a press pass and sit in the back or something, I don't think we'd be on the red carpet, and then now, know more about the Latin Grammys, and it's kind of a complicated institution anyway that often doesn't really give credence to the music that we love because of like racism and colorism and all sorts of different things. So it really was born out of like Vero and I's friendship and our love of music and our desire to find an outlet for that. I'm somebody who like has a lot of hobbies and like interests, and then love finding ways in which to like share that and expand on that. And so I think that's kind of an example of that. But yeah, now 4 years later, it's like, wow, here we are, like much deeper in this, I think, than we imagined, and much more work than we really understood it would be. But also, it offers a lot of joy and also an opportunity to process and express a lot and of what's going on. And there's been so many kind of like difficult moments and tragedies in those 4 years that we never anticipated. And Rather Minute has given me an outlet which to share about that and to connect with that and to use music as a medium for that.
One of my favorite things about hosting a feminist and queer podcast is the community that builds up around it, often without even, the host intending it or playing a huge role in it. And I know that you've certainly experienced that as well. Why is community building through podcasting so important for both of you? And how do you see your podcast kind of contributing to it?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I started blogging or in the early days of blogging. So there's some like comparisons to what it felt like to be a blogger in like the early 2000s to what it feels like to be a podcaster, the last few years, because they're both, I think, new mediums that like people don't really know where it's going to go. And there's a lot of excitement and also a lot of like learning as you go. But podcasting feels really different because there's so much intimacy between Vero and I through the podcast. Like a lot of people say it feels like they're just like hanging out with us. And I think that is what it feels like often. So the community aspect of it, I think, is a little more detached because we only really experience it through like Instagram comments or emails, or we've done a couple of like live events, but not very many. And then there'll be the fun experience of like somebody is like, oh my God, I know your show. You meet someone in the world and they're like, oh my God, I love your show. So I don't know. It feels a little bit detached. Like I know, and like I have the numbers. I'm like, okay, 3,000 people listen to that episode, but like, how do you actually feel that like connection to the community? So I don't know. I think it's been a kind of a strange thing, honestly. And like, just also grappling with like, when your work is very public, like what does it feel like to do that? And how do you maintain boundaries around like what you want to share, what you don't want to share? And I don't know, the podcasting has felt pretty vulnerable, I think, because it is, the stuff we talk about is often really raw and we're like, processing a lot of things in real time. And I don't know, there's something about it that feels more intimate to me than just writing has felt. And I think people feel like they know you pretty well when they listen to your podcast. And that's kind of a strange thing, because they don't really. Like when I was doing online dating, I would get, oftentimes people would tell me when we're messaging that they knew about my podcast. And that always felt so strange to me. Because I was like, I don't know anything about you, and you've listened to like hours of me talking about myself, So I don't know. I'm not sure I know how to answer the question about community building. I mean, I know that our podcast offers people something, and we get a lot of feedback about that people feel really like seen and heard, and that they get to connect culturally through the music that we're talking about, and that they have the same experiences of being like the children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. Like there's a lot of that. But I think for me, it's more of an outlet to explore those connections than it is necessarily build community, because I don't necessarily feel the community. There's a separation between me and the community,
So this brings me to my last and my favorite question that I get to talk with folks about, which really gets at the heart of that big why behind all of your projects, what kind of draws all of them together. And that's that version of a better world that you're working towards. When you sit down to record an episode, when you work on journalism, when you do any of the projects that you do in the world. So I will ask you this giant question that I think is also an important question, and one we don't get enough chances to talk about. What kind of world do you want?
Ooh, it's a heavy question right now because we're recording this what is it, March 18th, March 19th?
Yep, right in the middle of a global pandemic.
Yeah, a global pandemic that we really don't know how it's going to evolve. And it feels like a real scary time and an opportunity to really reimagine how we are in relationship with each other, because it's so clear how interconnected we all are, and also so clear how vulnerable many people are and many of us are, and how much the hoarding of resources really shapes those vulnerabilities, So I don't know, for many years I've said, and this is how I would define reproductive justice, that it's working toward building a world where everyone can create the kind of family that they want to create. And family is defined really broadly, not just about biological children. So I still believe that, I think we have to reimagine family in this kind of world that we're in. And these real crisis moments, after the election and after the Pulse massacre, what I've noticed is that my community gets really connected and really focused on loving and supporting each other. And that is really inspiring. And I think I want a world where that feels true, even when we're not in crisis, where we're really interconnected and we're really acting on the reality that our well-being is dependent on the well-being of our neighbors, of the people around us. And moving away from this individualistic mindset toward a mindset of that we're all in this together. So I think that's my hope, is that we build a society that is structured around that principle.
And I think that's a pretty good approach to take as we're all weathering the days ahead, for sure.
Yeah, it's kind of the only option we have. Yeah, it's you can't actually. You're interdependent. Whether you want to be or not. We are breathing the same air. We're touching the same surfaces. We really rely on each other's well-being. So it's people taking actions to protect the well-being of others over their necessarily their comfort or well-being in other ways. So
for sure.
It's a deep moment.
It is. It's a heavy one, but thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all of the ways that you have been and you currently are imagining otherwise.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Prasad and myself, Cathy Hannabach. Audio editing was provided by the awesome folks at Pro Podcast Solutions. You can check out the show notes and transcript for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guests and find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.